Frank Reich is the next coach of the Indianapolis Colts. Of course, that's not true. It's just a hilarious editorial mess up by The Score. In their defense, it would have been a pretty smart move. And if I'm being honest, when I first saw the headline, I actually believed it, and imagined Frank Reich making Jim Irsay crawl through a doggy door. Sadly, Frank Reich won't be hilariously returning to the Colts. Instead, he decided to take the Carolina Panthers job. As usual, he wasn't the first choice. That honor belongs to Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions. But, as usual, Frank Reich doesn't seem to mind. In his defense, it worked out pretty well for him last time. He got to coach Andrew Luck for a year, thanks to his lack of ego, and Jim Irsay's bathroom habits. It didn't take Reich very long to find a new gig, which is surprising because coaches of his ilk, retreads, tend to have to take a lap. A great recent example of what I'm talking about is his old boss, Doug Peterson. He won a Super Bowl with Nick Foles and Carson Wentz, and couldn't find a job for a year. In retrospect, that couldn't look like more of a mistake. Reich's resume isn't bad compared to Peterson's, and he was his OC during the year they won the Super Bowl. But unless you're one of these venerated types like Sean Payton, it's hard to find your second job. Obviously, I'm glad to see him land on his feet, and that the NFL doesn't have the same terrible taste in coaches that Jim Irsay does. But I think Frank Reich made a huge mistake choosing the Carolina Panthers, and not liking this video and subscribing to my channel. Actually, that's kind of a stupid bit because, I'm criticizing him. Why would he like this video? Maybe the channel, but not the video. Whatever, if you could just click like and subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. My biggest concern with this Panthers gig is the owner, David Tepper. He's the second richest owner in the NFL, but he's hedge fund rich. It feels appropriate to describe his running of the team as volatile, but volatility has highs and lows, and his time with the Panthers so far has just been lows. Of course, there's no one more uniquely qualified to deal with a erratic, meddlesome owner than Frank Reich. By the way, I think it's fair now that we can say that Reich has a type when it comes to owners. And teams too, now that I think of it. The Panthers and the Colts have basically had the last same few years, and both franchises had rosters that were overall very good, but missing a quarterback. The only difference was one team thought Sam Darnold was the answer, while the other thought Matt Ryan was Larry Bird walking through the door. Will history repeat itself now that Reich is the coach of the Panthers? Has Reich or Tepper learned from their mistakes? It's entirely possible. Coaches, owners learn from their mistakes sometimes. But if I was a betting man and or had a gambling sponsorship with FanDuel maybe, I don't know, I would definitely consider a Derek Carr futures bet. And honestly, it's the perfect landing spot for Derek Carr. But by perfect, I mean they will make the playoffs and lose in the wildcard round. Truth is, the Panthers aren't just one Derek Carr away from a Super Bowl. And I don't think any team really is, to be honest. But that's neither here nor there. The Panthers have a good roster full of offensive and defensive players. Stars like DJ Moore and Brian Burns. But these are players already on their second contract, or about to be in the case of Brian Burns. So signing Derek Carr to a $40 million contract, which I think based on the market might even be cheap, they're not going to have a lot of money to play with. So some perfect world, perfect storm, perfect team scenario where Derek Carr wins the Super Bowl just doesn't seem feasible with what they got right now. That's just assuming they go the Derek Carr retread route. Though I'm not entirely sure it would be that much better for them if they decided to do the sensible thing and draft a quarterback. The Panthers finished 7-9, which is kind of weird if you think about it, because they definitely felt worse than 7-9. That's because most of their wins came towards the end of the year. They weren't technically meaningless because they were basically one game out of winning the division, but thanks to trying to win a division at 8-9, they now are picking 9th in this year's draft. Which means if they want one of the, top 3 quarterbacks, like Levis, Stroud, or Young, they're going to have to make a pretty aggressive move. And yes, Anthony Richardson would be available at that spot, most likely. And I really like Richardson personally, but there isn't much in Frank Reich's history that makes you think Richardson would be the kind of guy that he'd want to take a chance on. considering that, you can see the Panthers trying to hatch a scheme to get one of those guys, which would feel very much like history rhyming. Sure, they're not trading for Baker Mayfield or convincing themselves that Sam Darnold is the guy, but it'd be another over-aggressive, over-leveraged move, which is fitting, of course, for a team owned by David Tepper. Of course, a good quarterback can definitely hide a lot of problems, but that's assuming that one of them turns out. They're all good prospects, but none of them have been labeled can't miss, and I mean most aren't can't miss. As the saying goes, beggars can't be choosers, but it doesn't always work out if you take what you can get. So all things considered, I think Frank Reich's in a tough spot. He's a really good coach, and I do hope he figures it out, because I think his style of offense is one that I wish the NFL had more of. But I'm concerned that things could snowball really fast, and this team could end up getting him fired. And if he were to wash out of Carolina, I could see it being very difficult for him to be able to find a third head coaching gig. Sure, Reich is very good and competent and all that, but hiring in the NFL isn't based on skill. It's based on perception. That is, what owners perceive of you. And it doesn't really matter the cards you were dealt. All that matters is whether or not you got it done. That said, it's not like there were other head coaching gigs that were great. And if anything, you could argue that Carolina was his best option. But he didn't necessarily have to go the head coaching route. And if anything, it might have been a pretty smart move to go after the offensive coordinator position for the Chargers. Reich was never interviewed for the job or offered, as far as we know. But I'm sure if Reich wanted to slum it as an OC for a year or two, I don't think the Chargers would have had a huge problem with that. Also, pairing Reich with Herbert, that definitely sounds like a MVP type season possibility, because he, in his past, did somehow make Carson Wentz look good. Imagine what he could do with Herbert. It'd be akin to Shanahan being the coordinator for the Falcons, and then parlaying that into the 49ers gig, which, I mean, if you think about it, Herbert is definitely more talented than Ryan. Just a year or two with Herbert, I'm pretty sure he would have had his choice of stable franchise. But then again, this was never going to happen. Not because it doesn't make sense, but because money. Reich was still under contract with Jim Irsay because Irsay had signed into a deal just before the season had started. If he were to take an OC position, he'd actually have to take a pay cut, since Irsay would no longer be on the hook. This is why you see some pretty big name coaches deciding to take these positions that seem like demotions. A good recent example is Brian Flores and his special defensive assistant title with the Steelers. If he had taken a coordinator position, Dolphins owner Stephen M. Ross would have a few more $1 million in his bank account. Anyways, it's too bad. Reich definitely feels like the one that got away, but luckily there's still plenty of other fish in the sea. Namely, Brian Johnson, I think, is a really intriguing candidate. What do you think? Did Frank Reich make the right move? Is Justin Herbert going to retire early like Andrew Luck because no one will be as good as Frank Reich? Was what I said really overdramatic? Leave a comment below and let me know. That's it for now. Thanks again for watching, listening, however it is you consume this. And if you could, please like, subscribe, and thanks again.